Discover Cambon Podcasts, conversations and audio documentaries imagined by Chanel that explore what inspires fashion, literature, cinema, dance, and savoir-faire. This series of rendezvous gathers artists and friends of the house. Listen to Cambon Podcasts at chanel.com and on the streaming platforms.
Happy Saturday. It's June 21st, 2025, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And the world might feel like it's melting down, but here at Airmail, we're going to cool you off. Right, well, this week in the news, we may be headed to war with Iran. Or maybe not. We might also be going to peace talks. Unclear. Who knows? Maybe we'll know something more in 2 weeks. Anyway, this is the world we live in. Meanwhile, in New York City, Brad Lander, the controller and also a candidate for mayor, was arrested and manhandled by ICE officers as he was attempting to shield an immigrant from them in a New York City courthouse. Meanwhile, in London, Royal Ascot has been a welcome distraction this week. And on today's episode, we will also do our best to give you a break from the news of the day.
We sure are. You know, first, we all know the Trump White House and the family are, as Scott Galloway has said, pulling off the biggest grift ever. And this week, Mitchell Prothero joins us with his report on why Jared Kushner, husband of Ivanka Trump, is pursuing a multi-billion-dollar development deal on an uninhabitable former Cold War airbase in Albania. Then, many of you are no doubt watching the new series on BritBox titled Outrageous, which charts the dazzling and controversial lives of the Mitford sisters, in particular the marriage between Diana Mitford and Oswald Mosley. Well, our colleague George Pendle will join us to remind us that the glamorous sisters' lives were more complicated than we know, filled with suicides, Nazi-esque orgies, and a classic P.G. Wodehouse character, the radioactive legacy of British fascist Oswald Mosley. And finally, Michelle Mone, the scandal-plagued lingerie hawker known as Baroness Bra, has become a pariah in her native United Kingdom. Now she's trying to start fresh in, where else? Florida. And Stu Heritage is going to join us from England to give us the story. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Well, Michael, I think it's been too long since we've had news of Jared and hopefully Ivanka, although I don't think she figures into Mitch Prothero's story. He is a writer who covers crime, terrorism, and corruption, among other things, and lives in, wait for it, Albania. Welcome, Mitch.
Thanks for having me.
So how are things in Albania?
It's getting warm and the tourists are arriving. It's the last couple of years, Albania has turned into sort of one of the hot spots for cheap European tourism, and they're headed into the EU, so we expect it to sort of increase. But because of their communist history, they've like some of the most undeveloped coast and mountains, and that's sort of what the peace ends up being about a little bit. And as a result, like each year, 1 million more people show up in a very small country for tourism. So it's pretty interesting to see.
We published a travel story about it in Airmail a few months ago, and I was just shocked by, one, how beautiful it is, and two, how low the prices are. And because of that, we're seeing a surge in development, correct?
Yeah, there's been development. There's a lot of interest in development. I think that obviously they need to nail down the EU membership, and that hasn't been easy for a lot of the post-Cold War Balkan countries, even though Albania wasn't in the former Yugoslavia. You know, you see like Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia and stuff. They're on the edge of joining the EU a lot, whereas Albania really needs to sort of get in there for the tourism to fully take off, much like Croatia managed to do in the last decade or so. And that's when I think you'll see a lot more development coming in from like the bigger chains and things like that. I think, you know, when you look at Marriott and the bigger resorts and hotel chains, they're going to wait to see that happening, which is why I think it's interesting to find like, you know, that Jared Kushner's investment group had partnered up to sort of get in on the ground floor in some ways. They were one of the first major international groups to come in looking to do a development deal.
So what part of the coastline did they settle on?
There's going to be two projects. The one that we cover in the story is about an island it's actually the largest uninhabited island in the Mediterranean. It's about 3 miles off the coast. The other project they're doing is a little more conventional. It's in the city of Lore, and the island is off the city of Lore as well. And it's in this sort of like a federally protected marshland area. There's been some environmental concerns, but those have really been railroaded by the fact that the government plans to put an airport outside of Lore. And so this is going to kind of become the travel hub for people who want to visit the coastline of Albania. One of the things they have working against them is, again, 50, 60 years as sort of the North Korea of Europe, very closed communist system until like 1991. The local infrastructure is not great.
Kushner obviously isn't spending his own money. So who's backing his venture and how much are they potentially investing in this?
Kushner's firm, Affinity, is backed primarily by Saudi investors to the tunes of billions of dollars. I've seen as much as $4 billion. Again, I'm not sure that because it's not publicly traded, it probably is a little opaque how much everybody's donated and, who the specific investors are. But the Saudi investment funds and MBS, the King of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, or the Crown Prince, I'm sorry, they seem to have a special interest in Kushner's activities. So I've heard at least $4 billion is the overall investment in this fund.
Most people are waiting on the sidelines. What's the worst thing that could happen right now to this project and to Kushner?
Albania is extremely protective of its reputation in terms of financial irregularities. It's got a long and understandable reputation for ties to money laundering and organized crime. There's no disputing that Albanians play a prominent role in the international cocaine trade. This isn't a secret or anything. As much as I do like the country, it definitely has, close ties to southern Italy, and a Calabria type Sicily feel to how things are run. And as a result, the cocaine trade, particularly in Europe, and this is something I've done a lot of reporting on in the past, it generates such huge amounts of money that this cash needs to go somewhere. And there's been a longstanding suspicion, and you can walk around Tirana and see it, and people even joke about how open it is this cash needs to go somewhere and it needs to get into the legitimate economy. You're talking billions of euros every year. In crypto now, or stacks of 100 euro bills or whatever. And one of the best ways to do that is through development projects. So what we've seen is a massive bubble of luxury apartment building in Tirana, considered probably the poorest, if not one of the poorest capitals in Western Europe. Average income's, 600-700 euros a month. And on my street alone, there's 100 to 200 new luxury apartments that are under construction that nobody in Albania can afford these. And my street is just one of many streets. There's all over the city. You see construction cranes, you see these giant luxury apartments.
So let's say we have cocaine trade, we have Saudi investment fund, we have Jared Kushner, we have Albanians sort of coming out of communist rule. All seems like a great place to take a risk.
I guess, fortune favors the brave on some level. I mean, you do have to risk a little bit. And it's probably a little bit easier when it's Saudi money and not your money.
Probably a little easier, too, when your father-in-law is the president of the United States.
When your father-in-law is the president of the United States, certainly things like this project had been announced a year ago or a year and a half ago. And it took Sazan Island in particular, because it's an old Soviet military base, an old Albanian military base. I say this in the piece. It looks like a Call of Duty video game set. It's beautiful in a rugged, spooky, zombie apocalyptic kind of way. But it had been a closed military zone for 60, 70 years. The Albanian people weren't even allowed to visit it until about 2009, I think. And when they announced the project, nobody told the defense ministry that this was suddenly a thing that was possible and that was going on. And they immediately put out a statement saying, we haven't approved this. I mean, we're not against it, but nobody told us. And very quietly, that complaint went away. And within a couple of days of President Trump's second inauguration, the project was completely approved by the government here of Prime Minister or President Edi Rama. Yeah, it's a little bit easier. And Rama does have, for such a small country, he's got really pretty good political ties across Europe and to the Trump administration and even to the Clinton administration. He was a featured speaker, toast, a guest at the wedding of Homa Abedin and Alex Soros over the weekend. Rama attended. I think there was 5 speakers. One of them was Hillary Clinton and one of them was him. So this is a guy who knows how to operate. The biggest curiosity I have is how you're going to put like a 6-star resort on an island that doesn't have any water. Yeah. So, there's going to be a bunch of fun logistical things that are going to have to be explained. What are they going to do about all the poisonous snakes? Things like that. The island's famous for not allowing camping because, again, it's covered with poisonous snakes. And if you get bitten by one, you're about a 3-hour round trip to the nearest hospital. So again, these clients are going to be able to use helicopters and stuff, but really it's got such a Bond villain volcano lair vibe to it that, just seeing how they plan to construct it, how they plan to get people to and from the island, how they plan to get food to and from the island, waste off of the island. Even if it does happen, I think on some level it'll be fascinating. And it's an area that I've never really covered before. So I look forward to learning about how you do all these things.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, there are some things that money can't buy, which is the clawback of your reputation, as Michelle Mone, otherwise known as Baroness Bra, knows all too well. She is a scandal-plagued English entrepreneur who became a politician in the House of Lords and is now trying to restart her life after a great scandal in Florida, of all places. Stuart Heritage, a writer-at-large at Airmail, explains. All right, well, Stu, we are delighted to have you back to talk about yet another woman with a large pronounced bust. Welcome.
Great, I've got a beat now, apparently. My children will be so proud.
Not touching that one.
That's for the best, Michael. You could get arrested for that. Gentlemen, so Stu, you take us inside the sordid tale of Michelle Mone, who's known here in the UK as Baroness Bra. I know this all sounds kind of like the opening credits to a pornographic film, but who exactly is Michelle Mone before we get into what she's done wrong?
Okay, Michelle Mone is the inventor of the Ultimo bra, which came out maybe 20 or 30 years ago, which is a bra that has a silicone gel insert, a cleavage-enhancing bra. And she came to notoriety because she took on, Wonder Bra and Ultra Bra, and for a time was doing very well out of it. But she's also just a fascinating person. She's very canny. She's just a master self-publicist. And as such, especially if you live in Britain, it feels like you've been reading about her on a daily basis for decades. And that was even before everything, went catastrophically wrong for her.
Stu, first of all, the whole concept of the House of Lords is so ridiculous as to barely seem plausible. But how exactly did Michelle Mone end up there?
So there's just been this documentary on the BBC about her, a 2-part documentary called The Rise and Fall of Michelle Mone. And it's so interesting because they tie the fact that this working class girl from, the rough end of Glasgow ended up being Baroness Mone of Mayfair in the House of Lords. It's partly because of, this is something that almost feels like it's lost to the winds of history. But about a decade ago, there was Scotland had an independence referendum where they wanted to see if they'd divest themselves from the rest of the UK. And she was a very staunch campaigner for, no, they shouldn't. They should stick with the UK. And I think as a sort of reward for campaigning basically on behalf of the government, she got handed her peerage. And it also turns out, according to the documentary, she was really overstating what a successful businesswoman she was. Her profits were going down every year and eventually into a loss. But she was presenting herself as this kind of Trumpian, all-powerful businesswoman. And she kind of tricked the government in a moment of confusion into this peerage. It's incredible.
And then meanwhile, she used her position for what else? Financial gain during the pandemic. Tell us all about the scandal that has plagued her during COVID.
So 2020, the British government opened what it called the VIP lane for PPE suppliers. If a government minister referred a company to the government, then they would be less subject to the sort of the regular checks and balances that other suppliers would be. Michelle Mone said that she could get millions of gowns and masks to the government for this company, which it turns out she didn't even set up until 5 days after the call. She was handed a £200 million government contract, and 125 of the gowns that she delivered were rejected by the NHS for being unsterile and unusable. So she's now being sued by the government to get £125 million of her money back.
So Stu, she's somewhat of a pariah in the UK, right? She can barely show her face in Waitrose these days. But what is her response? Go abroad. Where do we find her now?
She is about to move to Florida, which seems the done thing that any kind of vaguely scandal-hit British celebrity will try their luck in America next. Russell Brand did it. Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, who was Prime Minister for 7 weeks here, is a kind of a Republican hanger-on now. And now it seems like Michelle Mone, she's selling up all her houses. She's sold the yacht. All of her assets, just scrabbling together whatever she can, and she's going to hightail it to Miami, apparently. So she gets to be your problem instead of mine.
So we'll be seeing her at Mar-a-Lago at some point for sure then, right?
I almost guarantee it. If you're a woman with that level of delusions of grandeur, I think it's inevitable that you'll end up in Mar-a-Lago.
Because everything is crazy these days. I mean, we all know how Trump likes to pardon people in America who are celebrities accused of crimes or convicted of crimes. You could almost see him then calling Keir Starmer and saying don't you think she got a raw deal? Don't you think that's really not fair? And lobbying the UK for her justice, quote unquote.
That would be the red line that would cause an international war, because the strength of feeling against Michelle Mone is astonishing. She's the person that everyone in the country put all of their COVID frustrations, sort of aimed it directly at her. She's the villain of COVID. So I think, any sort of leniency shown towards her, there would be riots in the street.
I don't know if you know this, but they like riots in the streets these days.
So I heard. Great. I mean, everything's great, isn't it? Everything's amazing.
Say no more. Rendered you speechless, Stu. That's all we want to do.
Actually, the fact that she's going to Florida is kind of a brilliant move because her scandal is not widely known in the United States, and she still has that handy title. I want to call her Baroness Bra, but she's actually Baroness Mone of Mayfair. Is that correct?
Mayfair, the poshest part of London. So I think she's not to compare her to Meghan Markle, because Meghan Markle hasn't defrauded the government out of hundreds of millions of dollars. But it feels like it's the same sort of thing, that she's going to go over there and lord up, throw around her title to the easily fooled Americans.
Well, thank you for that, Stu. And thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Discover Cambon Podcasts, conversations and audio documentaries imagined by Chanel that explore what inspires fashion, literature, cinema, dance, and savoir-faire. This series of rendezvous gathers artists and friends of the house. Listen to Cambon Podcasts at chanel.com and on the streaming platforms.
Well, Michael, once again, Florida is shaping up to be, as Graydon Carter calls it, the Panama of the United States. Sunny place for shady people. Michael, speaking of unsavory characters, our colleague George Pendle is here to remind us all about the fascist Oswald Mosley, who's having a bit of a resurgence these days. George is the deputy editor here at Airmail. Welcome. Everyone in the Airmail universe is talking about the new television series Outrageous, which is about the life and times of the Mitford sisters. And in particular, it focuses on the marriage between Diana Mitford and Oswald Mosley. And you, as our official fascist reporter here at Airmail, have something to say about this and about him in particular. So first, before we get too deep into the Mosley situation, who were the Mitford sisters?
So the Mitford sisters were this incredibly glamorous, group of siblings who kind of gained their fame in the 1920s as kind of the heart of the bright young things. There were, a number of them. And the reason they were so incredibly, attractive to people's imagination was A, they were actually physically attractive, but B, they seemed to, involve themselves in all manner of different activities and varied activities. You had, Nancy Mitford, who was a novelist. You had Jessica Mitford, who was a rampant communist. You had Unity Mitford, who was a Nazi. You had Deborah, who eventually became a duchess. And you had Pamela, who was a more retiring one of the sisters, who became a farmer and an advocate for kind of organic farming. But all of them together, they kind of, with this sensation, it was kind of like a mixture between Meghan Markle and Prince Harry and the Kardashians. It was this kind of mix of aristocratic family with, intense celebrity.
And, it wasn't all glitz and glamour, though. I mean, some of them had quite controversial, even for the time, political views. So tell us a little bit about Diana Mitford and her lover turned husband, Oswald Mosley.
Well, yes, Oswald Mosley was a politician in the 1920s and 1930s. He was known for his oratory and being a very charismatic individual. And he had begun kind of on the left of politics as kind of a member of the Labour Party. And he was also, as well as being a politician, he was, well, perhaps all politicians are this, he went with the winds. So when he realized that his left-wing career wasn't really working out, he crossed over to the Conservatives. And when the Conservative, party wasn't really helping him, he created his own political party. This was known as the BUF, the British Union of Fascists. And it basically was kind of joining the whole kind of tide of fascism that was going on around the world in Germany and in Italy. And he created basically the equivalent of the Nazi Party in England, this British Union of Fascists. This was in the early 1930s. And he would often, give speeches dressed all in black. His followers were known as the Black Shirts. He would espouse anti-Semitic, anti-immigration, very pro-England views. He was a typical kind of English Nazi. And Diana Mitford was, possibly the most glamorous of the Mitford sisters. She had been written about by Evelyn Waugh back in Vile Bodies, when he wrote Vile Bodies. And she, basically fell in love with Oswald Mosley. She, had always leaned towards the right. She had been seen flashing a Nazi salute at a rally in Hyde Park when God Save the King was being played. So to her, as Sylvia Plath said, every woman loves a fascist. And for her, Oswald Mosley was her fascist. The two of them got married and became this notorious and glamorous couple in 1930s England.
But it was short-lived, wasn't it, George? I mean, ultimately it did come crashing down for them, at least temporarily.
Yes, although their marriage lasted for a very long time, Oswald Mosley's career as a politician and as the leader of the BUF was cut short by the start of World War II in 1939. Both Diana and Oswald were seen as threats to the state, and they were sent to Holloway Prison, where they would stay out the majority of the war. Their two young children, Max and Alexander, who were literally not more than 2 or 3 years old, were taken away from them and kind of raised by a nanny. But the two of them were in Holloway Prison until 1943, and then under house arrest for the rest of the war. In fact, they didn't even get their passports back until 1949.
And yet, George, intriguingly, that was not the end of Mosley's involvement in politics. How did he experience this resurgence in the 50s?
Now, you'd think that after World War II, the idea of, having been a Nazi in the years before would have, meant that he, hid under his blankets for the rest of his life. But he didn't. He went back to kind of the drawing board and created this new party called the Union Movement, which was not as popular as the BUF, but was just as virulent. It kind of spearheaded the whole idea of Holocaust denial. It was against, mixed race marriages, fervently against immigration. And Mosley kind of started this in 1948, just a few years while the Second World War was still in everybody's memory.
What happened to their children? They had 2 sons, Alexander and Max.
Yeah, this is kind of part of what the piece is really about. It's about what this legacy of fascism, meant for their children. And we all have relations who we don't get on well with or who have views that don't agree with us. But it's, it's a bit tricky, when you say, well, my mom and dad, they were married in Joseph Goebbels' living room and Adolf Hitler was one of the guests there. So, how do you cope with parents like that? And it seems that Max and Alexander, to begin with, in their teenage years, although they were loyal to their parents, they shied away from their father's politics. They were interested in rock and roll. There was an anecdote, which I mentioned in the piece, which is that Alexander would throw eggs at, leftist rallies with his father's supporters, but he would often just then go and join the rallies himself because he would see a friend who was involved in the march. So they weren't really committed fascists in any way. Alexander really stayed out of the limelight, but his brother Max was much more in the limelight. And he really was although he didn't really agree with his father's politics, he was a supporter of his father. In 1962, there was a march through London's heavily Jewish East End by Oswald Mosley and the Union Movement. And, they were marching through this heavily Jewish area, chanting Jews out. And there was a huge fight. And Max Mosley was arrested for, fighting the anti-fascists who attacked him. But he said, he was just defending his father. And there you kind of get this kind of strange dichotomy in the descendants of the Mosleys. How do you love your mother, love your father, and yet condemn them for what they did, in the war or before the war? And it's always been a problem for the Mosleys. Like Max Mosley, he got away from his family. He became the head of Formula One in the post-war years. And really, along with Bernie Ecclestone, his partner, became, responsible for turning Formula One into the sport we know today. But even then, that he couldn't quite escape the legacy of his family.
George, you got away from that, legacy, but yet, I guess maybe sometimes you can never really escape it, because I'm just thinking about when he was at Formula One, he got embroiled in a little bit of a controversy with some tapes came out that sort of showed maybe he did absorb some of this stuff, right?
Well, this is right. Although he said that he was, trying to get himself away from his family. In 2008, the News of the World, which was a notorious British tabloid, published a video of him taking part in what they termed a sick Nazi orgy. And, basically the News of the World said that here was Max Mosley, the son of Oswald Mosley, the great fascist leader of Britain, or the infamous fascist leader of Britain. And here he was taking part in an orgy with prostitutes who were wearing Nazi uniforms, and he was barking out orders in German. And it was clear that the apple hadn't fallen far from the tree in his respect. Now, Max Mosley said this wasn't the case at all, and he took the News of the World to court, saying they had breached his privacy. He said, yes, it was an orgy, an S&M orgy, which he partook of. And yes, he was speaking German in it, but he explained that he just kind of got a thrill out of speaking German. And he said, actually, the prostitutes weren't wearing Nazi uniforms. They were wearing just non-specific military uniforms. And although this seemed somewhat tendentious, the judge agreed with him and declared that the story wasn't in the public interest and awarded Max a large amount of money in legal costs and in damages. And Max Mosley went on to become this righteous campaigner for privacy laws, and if he was telling the truth in the court, which we have to believe as that was the verdict, you can imagine, it's terrible. You're 60 years old, you're having an orgy, as you like to do, and suddenly you're being accused of being this Nazi, and you can't even get away from your father's legacy in your 60s in the privacy of your own home. But, it really kind of never left him until he was really, until his deathbed, pretty much. In 2019, Max Mosley, who had made a fortune from his Formula One activities, donated £12 million to Oxford University. And this caused a huge furore. And this wasn't because of his sexual peccadillos, which had come out a few years before, but it was because his father had been Oswald Mosley, and the money was seen as tainted and dirty. And even though Max Mosley died, a couple of years later, he could never quite shake, this inheritance from his father.
Well, George, thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
I am kind of desperate to see this show, Michael Outrageous. Have you seen it yet?
I have not seen it, but I'm putting it on my list for sure.
It's on mine too. For some reason, I get BritBox in the US, but I don't get it here in the UK. It's all very confusing.
Very confusing.
Well, it is the end of the episode and the start of the weekend, and I know you've got something to recommend to us.
I do. It's a terrific book, the author of which, Molly Jong-Fast, we had in the issue a week or so ago. Molly, as some of you know, is not just a featured commentator on Morning Joe and CNN. She is also the daughter of the best-selling author of Fear of Flying, Erica Jong. And Molly's new memoir, How to Lose Your Mother, is a beautiful, powerful look at her relationship with her mother as her mother drifts into dementia. It's a book that's gorgeous in its writing and also, believe it or not, really funny, especially as Molly wrestles with the legacy of a mother who used her daughter, as material in every book she wrote. I highly recommend it. It's great. It's called How to Lose Your Mother by Molly Jong-Fast. And you, my dear?
Well, Michael, I have been immersed in the new novel by Edward St. Aubyn, the English novelist. It's called Parallel Lines, and in it picks up a storyline that he had addressed in his previous novel, which was called Double Blind and came out in 2021. And it takes us through the lives and times of a cast of somewhat complicated characters, both psychologically and otherwise, I suppose you could say. The protagonist is a man named Sebastian who's trying to find his biological mother who abandoned him as a boy. And Edward St. Aubyn is fundamentally, he does have sort of a sense of humor and satire, and that infuses the pages of this novel. So anyway, if you like these kinds of heady personal dramas and sagas and things that are quite plot rich, I think you will like it. It's called Parallel Lines by Edward St. Aubyn. All right, well, we want to wish you all a wonderful weekend, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us. Michael, will you please read us out?
Absolutely, and we'd like to thank our sponsor, Chanel. Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. And our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Keep Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music, but most of all, thank you again for joining us.